So hello guys, today we'll talk about some circuits which are uh, concerned with basal ganglia. So before really starting with the circuits, I'll name some of these things which I've drawn here. So this obviously is the brain, and we are concerned with these things here. These are the primary motor cortex and sensory cortex. Then this is your caudate nucleus. Then this thing right here is your putamen. This is called globus pallidus, which is divided into two parts: globus pallidus externus and globus pallidus internus. Then this is your substantia nigra. This is your subthalamic nucleus, and this thing finally you can see is your thalamus. And within the thalamus right now we are concerned with these two nuclei, your ventral anterior and ventral lateral nucleus. Now let's talk about some of the circuits which are involved with regulating the movements of the body, which involve basal ganglia. So first let's talk about the first pathway, that is the pathway number 1. It is also called your direct pathway, and let's see how it works. So first of all, you get your neurons from these primary sensory and motor cortex, and these send information to your striatum. Your caudate nucleus and putamen together are called striatum. Now the pathway from your cortex to striatum, it is a glutaminergic pathway. So the neurotransmitter here is glutamate, which is an excitatory neurotransmitter. So we'll put a positive sign up here, excitatory neurotransmitter. Then from your caudate nucleus and putamen, the neurons then go to your globus pallidus internus, that is here. And these neurons, these are GABAergic, so they release neurotransmitter GABA, which is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. So we'll put a minus sign here, right. Then from your globus pallidus internus, you have your neurons which go and synapse in your thalamus. These again are GABAergic, so they release the GABA neurotransmitter and are inhibitory. And finally from your thalamus, you have your excitatory pathway that goes to the cortex again. So what will be the output of this circuit? You see, the output from your thalamus to cortex is excitatory. So this thing here is excitatory, and this neuron right here is inhibiting this excitatory output, and these neurons here are inhibiting this inhibitory neuron. So inhibition is inhibited. So in mathematics also, when you have two negatives, it becomes positive. So this inhibitory pathway is itself inhibited, and this is called disinhibition. So this is disinhibition. And how it is happening: you get your signals from your cortex via these excitatory glutaminergic neurons. These excitatory neurons stimulate these inhibitory neurons. These inhibitory neurons further inhibit this second inhibitory neuron, which was supposed to inhibit this excitatory neuron, but because of disinhibition, it is not doing so. So the final output of the pathway is excitatory. So your direct pathway is excitatory. Now, where is this direct pathway used? It is used in initiation of movements. Right? Now let's talk about your second pathway, that is the indirect pathway. So let's start with the pathway number 2, the indirect pathway. Alright. So again in this pathway as well, you get your excitatory glutaminergic neurons from your cortex to striatum, that is the caudate nucleus and the putamen, which is excitatory. From your globus, from your caudate nucleus and putamen, you get your GABAergic neurons, but this time instead of going to the globus pallidus internus, they first go to globus pallidus externus. So your GABAergic neurons, let's do it with a different color. Your GABAergic neurons go to globus pallidus externus. These are inhibitory, and then from globus pallidus externus they go to the subthalamic nucleus. These again are GABAergic fibers which are inhibitory. So we get these inhibitory fibers. Now from the subthalamic nucleus, the fibers coming are glutaminergic, that is excitatory. And in the first pathway we already saw that from globus pallidus internus we get inhibitory GABAergic neurons to the thalamus. And our final pathway from thalamus to the cortex was excitatory, right? Now if you can see, these neurons coming from the cortex are excitatory, and these give positive signals to these second order neurons. So these inhibitory neurons, these brown colored ones, are excited. These are excitated. Then these neurons further synapse with this inhibitory neuron, so we get 2 negative here. So these 2 negatives will become positive, so there will be increased action potentials in this red neuron which is excitatory. So there is increased excitation of this neuron. This further is synapsing onto an inhibitory neuron, so there will be very increased action potentials in this inhibitory neurons, and there will be very significant inhibition of thalamus. So the outflow from thalamus, which was excitatory, is reduced because of this increased stimulation of inhibitory neuron coming from globus pallidus internus. So which means that our output from our indirect pathway is inhibitory. So our indirect pathway is inhibitory. And where is this used? It is used in stopping the movements. Now coming on to the third pathway, this is the pathway number 3. It is basically how the nigrostriatal pathway influences the pathway number 1 and 2, right? So this is your substantia nigra. Let's first draw the first pathway that we have already discussed. So in the first pathway we had neurons glutaminergic from your cortex onto your striatum. Then from your striatum we had GABAergic inhibitory neurons to your globus pallidus internus. Then these in turn were synapsing with inhibitory neuron, which went to your thalamus, and from thalamus an excitatory neuron to your cortex, right? So how does this substantia nigra is influencing this pathway? There are neurons coming from substantia nigra which synapse onto these striatal pathways, and there are these receptors present which are called D1 receptors, dopaminergic D1 receptors, and these D1 receptors are actually excitatory. So the overall influence of this excitatory D1 influence is that the wanted movement. So see, the pathway number 1 was used for initiation of movement. So your nigrostriatal pathway or substantia nigra actually increases your wanted movements via your D1 receptors, which are excitatory. So let's just talk quickly about how this works. So you had your stimulatory glutaminergic pathway, which led to stimulation of this inhibitory GABAergic pathway, and which was synapsing with this inhibitory GABA neuron. So there was disinhibition. Now, since this dopaminergic neuron, these nigrostriatal pathway was synapsing onto these D1 receptors, then these D1 receptors are excitatory. So there will be increased excitation of these inhibitory neurons, which in turn will lead to more disinhibition. So there will be increased stimulation of cortex from the thalamus. So wanted movements will be increased. Now let's talk about how this nigrostriatal pathway influences the pathway number 2, that is the indirect pathway. So in your indirect pathway, as we have already discussed, you had your glutaminergic neurons coming from cortex onto your striatum, which was excitatory. Then you had neurons, GABAergic inhibitory neurons from your striatum to your globus pallidus externus, GABAergic inhibitory neurons. Then from globus pallidus externus they went to your subthalamic nucleus. From subthalamic nucleus you had your excitatory glutaminergic neurons to your globus pallidus internus. Then from globus pallidus internus, inhibitory GABAergic neurons to your ventral, anterior, and ventrolateral nucleus of thalamus. And finally your excitatory pathway from thalamus to your cortex, right? Let me mark these. And inhibitory. Alright. Now, in the pathway number 2, that is the inhibitory pathway, your nigrostriatal pathway is again acting on these striatum, but instead of your D1 receptors, here D2 receptors are present, and these D2 receptors are inhibitory. So you have your D2 inhibitory receptors, and the overall influence of this circuit, this interference of your nigrostriatal pathway is increase in unwanted movements. So it inhibits the stoppage of movement, that is, it increases unwanted movements. Previously, when the nigrostriatal pathway was affecting your direct pathway, it was increasing your wanted movements. Also, via working on the indirect pathway, it is also increasing your unwanted movements. So that will be all for this. Next we will talk about the drug treatments in Parkinson.